My name is Olivia. I was 39 years old the day I realized I had spent 6 years begging a man to choose me without ever saying the words out loud. It wasn't when I caught him texting another woman. It wasn't when he forgot my birthday for the second year in a row. It wasn't even when he told me he just needed more time after 6 years together. No. The moment that changed everything happened in the middle of a crowded restaurant when he looked at me, smiled like we were strangers, and introduced me as someone who's been helping me out. Someone, not the woman who had loved him, not the woman who had sacrificed promotions, friendships, and pieces of herself to build a future with him, not the woman who had quietly celebrated every promotion, every milestone, every victory, as though it were her own. Just someone. The room kept moving around us. Forks scraped plates. Glasses clinked. People laughed. Conversations flowed without interruption. Nobody else knew a life had just split cleanly in two, and in that single moment, something inside me became perfectly quiet. He thought I would keep waiting. He thought I would keep proving my worth. He thought I'd keep begging to be chosen. What he didn't know was that I had already made a decision. I wasn't going to fight for a place in the life of a man who had already decided I belonged somewhere else, and before this story was over, he was going to learn what happens when the woman he underestimated finally chooses herself. But before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. If someone had asked me a year earlier whether I believed love required sacrifice, I would have answered without hesitation. Of course it did. Love meant compromise. Love meant patience. Love meant staying when things became difficult. At least, that's what I believed. Looking back now, I realize I had confused sacrifice with disappearance. Little by little, year after year, I'd become smaller without noticing it. The strange thing about losing yourself is that it rarely happens all at once. It happens in ordinary moments. The restaurant you stop choosing because he doesn't like it. The vacation you postpone because his schedule matters more. The promotion you convince yourself can wait. The friends you promise you'll call next week. Eventually you wake up one morning and realize your entire life has been arranged around another person's comfort. That realization doesn't arrive dramatically. It arrives quietly, almost politely, like a stranger knocking on your front door. My name is Olivia Bennett. At 39, I worked as Director of Community Programs for one of the largest nonprofit healthcare organizations in Northern Virginia. My work mattered. Every week, I coordinated outreach programs for families who couldn't afford preventive health care. I managed grants worth millions of dollars, led teams across 3 counties, presented before state officials. People often described me as dependable, calm under pressure, the woman who could solve problems without raising her voice. At work, people trusted my judgment. At home, I questioned every instinct I had. Funny how that happens. Confidence isn't always transferable. Sometimes you're powerful in every room except the one where your heart lives. The man I loved was Ethan Brooks, 42, successful commercial real estate broker, polished, intelligent. The kind of man who remembered everyone's names at networking events and somehow made every conversation feel important. People admired him. My friends adored him. My family believed I'd finally found someone worthy of me. I believed it too. For a long time. Ethan wasn't cruel in obvious ways. That would have been easier. Cruelty wrapped in kindness is much harder to recognize. He never shouted, never slammed doors, never called me names. Instead, he specialized in making me question my own expectations. If I wanted more time together, he'd tell me I was being needy. If I asked why he'd canceled another dinner, he'd remind me how demanding his career had become. If I mentioned feeling lonely, he'd smile sadly and say, "I wish you could see how hard I'm working for our future." And somehow, I always ended up apologizing. Our friends described us as stable, reliable, the couple everyone expected to get married eventually. Eventually, that word became the soundtrack of our relationship. Eventually, we'd buy a house. Eventually, we'd set a wedding date. Eventually, we'd travel. Eventually, we'd start trying for children. Eventually. Years can disappear inside that word. One rainy Thursday evening, I found myself sitting alone in our apartment, with 2 theater tickets resting on the coffee table. We'd bought them 3 months earlier. A Broadway touring production I'd wanted to see since it was announced. Ethan texted 32 minutes before curtain. Emergency client dinner. Rain check? No apology. No explanation beyond those 3 words. Rain check. I stared at the message for a long time. Then I folded the tickets neatly in half and placed them inside the drawer beside the television. Not because I planned to use them later, because I couldn't bear throwing them away. That drawer held other things too. Concert tickets, boarding passes, reservations we'd never kept, little paper reminders of promises postponed. Looking back, that drawer was really a museum, an exhibition dedicated to all the lives we'd never actually lived. The following Saturday, my younger sister Claire stopped by unexpectedly carrying coffee and blueberry muffins. She looked around the apartment. "You've changed the artwork." "I did?" "The living room." I looked where she was looking. She was right. The photographs I'd once loved had disappeared. In their place hung abstract prints Ethan had picked out during a design showroom visit. When did that happen? I genuinely couldn't remember. Claire noticed my expression. "You okay?" "Of course." "You hesitated." "I'm tired." She smiled gently. "No, Liv." She reached across the kitchen island and squeezed my hand. "You're lonely." Nobody had said the word out loud before. Lonely. It echoed through the room louder than it should have. I laughed softly to make it disappear. "It isn't that bad." Claire didn't argue. She simply looked around the apartment again. Then she asked a question I wasn't prepared for. "If Ethan moved out tomorrow," she paused, "which parts of this place would still look like yours?" I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. Because I didn't know. And somewhere deep inside me, that frightened me more than I wanted to admit. 3 weeks later, Ethan suggested dinner with several business associates at one of the city's newest restaurants. He seemed unusually enthusiastic. "I want everyone to finally meet you," he said. The words warmed something inside me. Finally, maybe this was the beginning of something different. Maybe, eventually, had finally arrived. I spent far too much time choosing a dress. Not because I wanted strangers to admire me, because I wanted Ethan to look at me the way he used to. Sometimes hope makes us do exhausting things. I didn't know then that hope was about to become the most expensive emotion I'd ever carried. The restaurant overlooked the Potomac, its floor-to-ceiling windows reflecting the lights of the city like tiny stars scattered across black water. It was the kind of place people visited when they wanted photographs that looked effortless and bills that certainly weren't. Ethan liked places that made success visible. He believed appearances opened doors before words ever could. As we walked through the entrance, the hostess greeted him by name. He smiled in the easy, practiced way I'd watched hundreds of times before. The smile was warm enough to make people feel special, but measured enough to leave them wanting more. It had worked on clients. It had worked on investors. For 6 years, it had worked on me. Our table sat near the windows. 6 place settings, polished silverware, fresh white flowers arranged in a low crystal vase. 2 couples were already seated. Ethan introduced me with confidence, placing his hand lightly against the middle of my back. "This is Olivia." No title, no explanation, no, "the woman I've built my life with." Just Olivia. I noticed it because I noticed everything. One of the women smiled warmly. "So nice to finally meet you. Ethan talks about your nonprofit work." I smiled back. "Only the good parts, I hope." She laughed. "I'm Melissa." Her husband introduced himself as Daniel, one of Ethan's senior clients. The conversation flowed easily after that. Healthcare, travel, the economy, books, children heading off to college, the kind of conversations adults have when everyone is trying to discover who belongs in the room. Halfway through appetizers, another woman arrived. She apologized for running late. Traffic, conference call, the usual. She couldn't have been older than 32. Elegant without trying too hard. Dark hair pulled into a neat knot. Confident handshake. "Ethan, thank you for saving me a seat." He stood immediately. Of course he did. He pulled out the chair beside him. Not beside me, beside him. "This is Avery Collins," he said, "our newest acquisitions consultant." Avery smiled. "So you're Olivia?" Something about the way she said my name made me pause. Not rude, not surprised, almost familiar, as though she'd already heard it many times. That thought stayed with me far longer than it should have. Dinner continued. Everyone laughed. Wine glasses emptied and filled again. Stories moved around the table. Yet every few minutes I noticed something small. Ethan already knew how Avery took her coffee. She finished one of his stories before he did. When the waiter asked about dietary restrictions, Ethan answered for her without hesitation. No shellfish, she smiled. You remembered. Of course. Tiny things, individually meaningless. Together, they formed a picture I wasn't yet willing to examine. By dessert, Melissa leaned toward me. How long have you two been married? I laughed softly. We're not. Her eyebrows lifted. Oh. A brief silence. I assumed. She looked toward Ethan. I've heard him mention you for years. We've been together 6. Another pause. 6? She seemed genuinely surprised. I thought. She stopped herself. It's nothing. What? She smiled politely. I guess I just assumed there would have been a wedding by now. People often think honesty hurts because it's cruel. Sometimes honesty hurts simply because it's ordinary. The conversation moved on. Mine didn't. On the drive home, rain tapped softly against the windshield. Ethan hummed along to the radio, completely relaxed. I watched the lights blur through the glass. Ethan? When Melissa asked if we were married, he glanced over briefly. What about it? Did it bother you? He smiled. Should it? I don't know. He reached across the console and squeezed my hand. Liv. That nickname. Gentle, comforting, dangerous. We've talked about this. I know. My schedule's been insane. I know. I want forever. I know. He smiled again. I just need you to trust the timing. Timing. Another word people use when they don't want to say never. I nodded anyway. Because that's what I always did. The next Monday began like every other. Morning meeting. Grant review. Budget approval. A staff member stopped by my office carrying a thank you card from a family whose daughter had received emergency treatment through one of our outreach programs. I read the handwritten note twice. You changed our lives. Funny. Complete strangers saw my value more clearly than the man I planned to marry. At lunch, my colleague Rebecca slid into the chair across from me. She'd worked with me for nearly 8 years, long enough to recognize my silences. You've been somewhere else lately. I've just been busy, she smiled knowingly. Olivia. What? You only stir your coffee when you're anxious. I looked down. She was right. I'd been stirring an empty cup for nearly 30 seconds. I didn't even notice. I know. She waited. The best listeners always do. Finally, I asked, can I ask you something? Anything. Have you ever stayed in something because you loved who someone used to be instead of who they are now? Rebecca didn't answer immediately. Instead, she folded the paper napkin beside her plate. Carefully. Twice. Then she said, no. I blinked. No? I stayed, because I hoped they'd become who I imagined they could be. She smiled sadly. Turns out imagination is a terrible relationship counselor. I laughed despite myself. Then she asked quietly, does Ethan still make you feel chosen? The question landed somewhere deep, not because I didn't know the answer, because I did, and I wasn't ready to say it aloud. That evening, I arrived home before Ethan. The apartment felt unusually quiet. I wandered into the spare bedroom we'd always called the future nursery. Funny thing about rooms built around future plans, they collect silence faster than furniture. The walls were still bare, the closet still empty. A folded crib catalog sat on the shelf exactly where I'd left it almost 18 months earlier. I picked it up. Dust clung lightly to the cover. 18 months. Nobody had even opened it. I set it back exactly where it had been. When Ethan came home an hour later, he was unusually cheerful. I've got great news. I looked up from the kitchen. What happened? My firm's hosting a leadership retreat next month. That's wonderful. They're only inviting senior associates and executives. He loosened his tie. It's a big deal. Where is it? A resort outside Asheville. For how long? 4 days. I smiled. You've earned it. He kissed my forehead. I knew you'd understand. I meant those words. At least I thought I did. Later that night, while folding laundry together, I asked casually, can spouses come? He didn't look up. No. Not unusual. Corporate retreats often had restrictions. The conversation ended there. Or at least, I thought it had. 2 days later, I stopped by Ethan's office to surprise him with lunch. He'd forgotten his wallet that morning. I figured he'd appreciate it. The receptionist smiled warmly. Oh, he stepped out. Client meeting? She checked the calendar. No. She frowned slightly. Leadership retreat planning session. I smiled politely. Right. She looked back at the screen. Funny. What? I thought those planning meetings ended yesterday. I kept smiling. They probably added another. Maybe. She shrugged. I'm still learning everyone's schedules. I left the lunch with her and walked back to my car. The drive back to work took 22 minutes. During those 22 minutes, one thought repeated itself over and over. Why would someone lie about something so small? It wasn't the retreat. It wasn't the schedule. It was the ease. The lie had arrived without hesitation. As naturally as breathing, people don't usually become comfortable lying overnight. Comfort comes from repetition, and for the first time in 6 years, I found myself wondering how many conversations I'd accepted simply because I wanted them to be true. I had no idea then that the answer would change everything. Some people think trust disappears in one dramatic moment. It doesn't. Most of the time, trust erodes quietly, like water wearing away stone. You don't notice it while it's happening. Then one morning, you reach for something solid and discover there's nothing left to hold. I didn't confront Ethan after leaving his office that afternoon. I didn't ask why he'd lied. I didn't accuse him of anything. For 6 years, I had been reacting to the stories he gave me. For the first time, I decided to observe instead. That decision changed everything. The following week settled into its usual rhythm. Monday staff meetings, Tuesday grant reviews, Wednesday site visits, Thursday donor presentations, Friday reports. My work demanded precision, and for the first time in months, I welcomed that. Numbers didn't manipulate you. Deadlines didn't rewrite history. Budgets either balanced or they didn't. Life would have been much easier if relationships worked the same way. Every evening, Ethan came home carrying a different version of himself. Some nights he was affectionate, some nights distracted, some nights unusually generous. Flowers appeared one Wednesday for no reason. A reservation at my favorite Italian restaurant showed up the following Friday. He even suggested we spend an entire Sunday together. 6 months earlier, those gestures would have convinced me everything was fine. Now they raised a different question. Why now? People often mistake kindness for consistency. They're not the same thing. Consistency doesn't appear only after you've begun asking questions. That Sunday morning, Ethan insisted on making breakfast. The smell of coffee drifted through the apartment before I even opened my eyes. I walked into the kitchen to find pancakes, fresh fruit, and orange juice already waiting. He smiled when he saw me. There she is. I smiled back. You've been busy. I figured you deserved a morning off. I kissed his cheek. Thank you. It was genuine. Kindness deserves gratitude, even when you're uncertain about its timing. We ate slowly, talked about nothing important. Movies, the weather, whether we should repaint the guest room. Normal conversations, comfortable conversations. At one point, Ethan reached across the table and brushed a strand of hair away from my face. You've seemed different lately. I looked up. Different how? I don't know. He shrugged. Quieter. I've been busy. He studied me for a second longer than usual. You know, you can tell me anything. The irony nearly made me laugh. Instead, I nodded. I know. Later that afternoon, Ethan left for the gym. I'll only be gone an hour. The apartment fell silent. I carried my coffee into the living room and sat beside the window. Rain tapped softly against the glass. I wasn't looking for evidence. Not yet. I was thinking, trying to remember when I'd last made a decision that belonged entirely to me. It took longer than I expected. Then I remembered. A pottery class. Almost 4 years earlier. I'd signed up because I'd always wanted to learn. The class met every Wednesday evening. I attended exactly 3 sessions. The 4th week, Ethan had a networking dinner. He asked if I could skip class because he didn't want to attend alone. I skipped. The next week became another client dinner, then travel, then fatigue. Eventually, I stopped going altogether. The unfinished ceramic bowl still sat in a cabinet somewhere, wrapped in newspaper. I wondered how many versions of myself had been quietly packed away like that bowl. Monday morning began with a quarterly leadership meeting. Near the end of the presentation, our CEO announced an unexpected retirement. The room fell silent. Then came another announcement. We'll begin interviewing for Vice President of Community Strategy next month. Several people exchanged glances. It was one of the most significant positions in the organization, a promotion that would almost double my salary. As everyone filed out, Rebecca caught up with me. "You should apply." I laughed. "That's ambitious. So are you." "I'm not sure." She stopped walking. "Olivia." "What? Whose voice just answered me?" I frowned. "What do you mean? That wasn't yours." She smiled gently. That sounded like someone who spent years convincing herself not to want too much. Her words followed me all day. That evening, Ethan came home carrying a garment bag. "Need this pressed before Asheville." "The retreat?" "Yeah." He hung it carefully inside the closet. I noticed something attached to the zipper. A luggage tag. Nothing unusual. Except, printed beneath his name was one line. "Guest reservation confirmed guest." I stood there for a fraction of a second. Maybe all attendees received the same tag. Maybe the hotel printed them automatically. Maybe. Hope is remarkably creative. I closed the closet door, said nothing. 3 days later, I was leaving the office when my phone rang. "Claire, you busy?" "Driving home." "I found something." Her voice sounded uncertain. "What is it?" "I wasn't looking." "Looking for what?" She hesitated. "I ran into Melissa." "The woman from dinner?" "At the bookstore." I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. She asked how wedding planning was going. Silence. I told her there wasn't really any planning. Another pause. "Olivia." "What?" "She thought you and Ethan had been engaged for almost 2 years." The car suddenly felt very small. "What?" "That's what she said." I pulled into an empty parking lot. "Are you sure?" "Positive." Claire's voice softened. "She even asked whether you'd picked a venue yet." I couldn't finish the sentence. Because there wasn't one. There had never been one. 6 years together. Conversations. Promises. Someday. Eventually. But no ring. No date. No venue. No plan. Somehow, everyone else believed a future existed that I had never actually seen. That night, after Ethan fell asleep, I stood alone on the apartment balcony. The city stretched out beneath me. Lights glowing in hundreds of windows, thousands of lives unfolding behind them. I wondered how many people were awake, questioning the stories they'd built their lives around. Then, something unexpected happened. Not anger, not heartbreak, not panic. Embarrassment. I wasn't embarrassed because Ethan had disappointed me. I was embarrassed because I had become so skilled at explaining away disappointment that I'd stopped recognizing it. That realization hurt more than any lie ever could. The following Friday, an email arrived from Human Resources. Applications for Vice President of Community Strategy officially opened. I stared at the message for almost 5 minutes. Then I clicked Save Draft. Not Submit, not Delete. Just Save Draft. For the first time in years, a door had opened that had absolutely nothing to do with Ethan. I had no idea then that walking through it would eventually require me to leave far more behind than a relationship. Because while I was finally beginning to ask questions about my own future, someone else had already begun making plans for theirs, and those plans did not include me. There comes a moment in every difficult season when the questions change. At first, I wanted to know whether Ethan was lying. Then I wanted to know why. But somewhere between the unanswered conversations and the quiet drives home from work, I realized I had started asking a different question altogether. Who was I becoming while I waited for answers that might never come? That question stayed with me longer than any suspicion ever had. The following Monday, I opened the draft application for Vice President of Community Strategy again. The cursor blinked patiently at the top of the screen, almost as if it had all the time in the world. I didn't. For 6 years, I had measured every major decision against Ethan's plans. Would this promotion mean longer hours? Would another city make his commute harder? Would traveling interfere with his networking events? Without realizing it, I had slowly made him the center of decisions that belonged to me. It wasn't something he had demanded outright. It had happened one compromise at a time, one postponed dream, one delayed opportunity, one maybe next year, until eventually, my future had become something I negotiated instead of something I built. That afternoon, I clicked submit. No dramatic music, no deep breath, just one quiet click. A confirmation email arrived less than 30 seconds later. I stared at it for a long time. It felt strangely unfamiliar to make a decision that belonged entirely to me. That evening, I didn't mention the application, not because I was hiding it, because I wanted one thing in my life that existed before someone else's opinion reached it. For years, I had shared every idea before it had the chance to grow. Every dream became a discussion. Every possibility became a negotiation. This one, I wanted to hear it in my own voice first. Wednesday afternoon, Rebecca knocked gently on my office door. "You submitted." "I did." She smiled. "I knew you would." "I almost didn't. But you did." She leaned against the doorframe. "Can I tell you something?" "Always. The people who deserve leadership usually spend the most time wondering whether they're ready." I laughed. "And the people who aren't ready? They're usually convinced they already are." For the first time in weeks, I laughed without forcing it. That Friday, an email arrived from Human Resources. Interview scheduled. The following Tuesday, I read it twice before closing my laptop. Outside my office window, the parking lot shimmered in the late afternoon sun. For reasons I couldn't explain, I suddenly thought about my mother. She used to say success wasn't loud. It sounds like a woman sleeping peacefully because she doesn't owe anyone an explanation. I hadn't slept peacefully in a very long time. Saturday morning brought another surprise. Claire called just after 9. "Coffee?" "I've got errands." "You always have errands." "I do." "No," she laughed. "You make errands whenever you don't want to answer questions." 30 minutes later, she appeared outside my apartment carrying 2 paper cups anyway. We walked through a nearby park where families chased toddlers across the grass, and older couples fed ducks beside the lake. Claire watched me for a while before speaking. "You've changed." "I have. You aren't trying to convince me everything's fine anymore." I smiled. "Maybe I'm tired." "No," she shook her head. "I think you're finally being honest with yourself." The breeze lifted fallen leaves across the walking path. I spent years thinking love meant proving I was worth staying for. Claire stopped walking. "And now?" I looked across the lake. "I think real love shouldn't require an audition." Neither of us spoke for several moments. Some truths deserve silence after they're spoken. Later that evening, Ethan came home unusually excited. "You won't believe what happened." "What?" "Our firm landed the Harrison redevelopment project. I know how important that account is." "It's career-changing." He kissed my forehead. "We're celebrating next Friday." "That sounds wonderful. My boss wants everyone there." He smiled. "Spouses, too." The word lingered in the room. Spouses, not partners, not girlfriends, not someone who's been helping me out. Spouses. I wondered whether he even noticed the difference. The following Tuesday, I sat outside the interview room 20 minutes early. My hands rested calmly in my lap, not because I wasn't nervous, because I finally understood something. Whether I got this promotion or not, showing up for myself mattered. The interview lasted just over 90 minutes. Questions about leadership, conflict resolution, budget management, community partnerships. I answered each one honestly. When it ended, the panel thanked me warmly. Walking back to my car, I felt lighter than I had in years. Not because I believed I'd gotten the job, because I'd remembered something I'd almost forgotten. I was good at what I did, very good, and no relationship should ever make a person forget their own competence. 3 days later, an unfamiliar number appeared on my phone during lunch. "This is Margaret Lawson, from Human Resources." My heartbeat quickened. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all. We're still completing interviews." "I understand." She paused. "But I wanted to ask whether you'd be available to meet privately tomorrow morning." My stomach tightened. "Is something wrong?" "No." Another brief pause. "It's regarding information that came up during the hiring process." After the call ended, I stared at my phone. Information? What information? I replayed every interview answer in my mind, every document I'd submitted, Every performance review. Nothing made sense. That night, sleep refused to come. By morning, I had imagined a dozen possibilities. None of them prepared me for what Margaret placed on the conference table. It was a printed email. My name appeared in the subject line. My pulse quickened. "I thought you should see this before we proceed," Margaret said gently. The message had been sent anonymously 6 months earlier. It claimed I lacked the emotional stability for executive leadership, that I struggled under pressure, that promoting me would create serious management concerns. No evidence, no examples, just carefully written doubt. I looked up slowly. "Who sent this?" Margaret folded her hands. "We don't know. The sender had used a temporary email account. The investigation had reached a dead end. We ignored it because your employment record says the exact opposite." She offered me a reassuring smile. "But I wanted you to know it existed." I read the message again. Then again, someone had tried to quietly close a door before I ever reached it. I folded the paper carefully and placed it back on the table. For the first time since all of this began, my instincts weren't asking who had hurt me. They were asking who had something to gain from making me doubt myself. And deep inside, a name surfaced before I was willing to admit it. Not because I had proof, because sometimes the hardest thing to accept isn't that someone lied. It's realizing they may have been quietly shaping the limits of your life while convincing you those limits were your own. Margaret's office overlooked the hospital courtyard. Patients wandered slowly along brick pathways below, some with IV poles, others holding the hands of people who refused to let them walk alone. I folded the anonymous letter one final time and slipped it into my notebook. "I appreciate you showing me," I said. Margaret nodded. "I debated whether I should." "I'm glad you did." She smiled gently. "Your work speaks for itself, Olivia. One anonymous email doesn't erase 12 years of excellence." I thanked her and walked out into the hallway. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't thinking about Ethan. I was thinking about myself, not the woman I'd become, the woman I'd stopped being. That evening I drove home without turning on the radio. Silence no longer frightened me. It gave me room to think. At a red light, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. There were faint lines around my eyes that hadn't been there 6 years earlier. My hair was tied back the way I always wore it when I was tired. I looked responsible, dependable, capable. But somewhere along the way, I had stopped looking like a woman who expected joy. That realization hurt in a way betrayal never could. Because betrayal comes from someone else. Abandoning yourself is something you slowly do alone. When I walked into the apartment, Ethan was setting the dining table. Candles, music, my favorite pasta. He looked up with an easy smile. "I thought we'd stay in tonight. It smells wonderful." He came over and kissed my forehead. "Long day?" "The usual." He searched my face for a moment. "You sure?" "I'm sure." For a second, I wondered if he truly noticed something changing, or if he simply noticed that I had stopped making everything easy. Dinner was pleasant, almost too pleasant. He talked about the Harrison redevelopment project, a new investor, a possible expansion. I listened, really listened, not because I was trying to impress him, because I was quietly measuring something. How often did he ask about me? 23 minutes passed before he finally said, "And work?" I smiled. It was productive. "What happened?" "We're interviewing for a vice president position." He nodded politely. "That's good." No questions, no curiosity, no excitement. The conversation drifted back to his presentation before I could even take another bite. Years ago, I would have ignored that moment. Now I wrote it down in my mind, not because it proved anything, because patterns matter more than isolated moments. Saturday morning, Claire invited me to a neighborhood farmer's market. Ordinarily, I would have declined. Too much to do. Laundry, groceries, planning around Ethan's schedule. Instead, I said yes. The market overflowed with flowers, fresh bread, handmade pottery, and musicians playing old jazz beneath white tents. It felt wonderfully ordinary. Claire disappeared toward a coffee stand, while I wandered through a booth displaying handmade journals. The elderly woman running the stall smiled warmly. "Looking for a gift?" I picked up a leather-bound notebook. "No," she smiled knowingly. Then maybe you're looking for a place to begin. Something about that sentence settled inside me. I bought it. Not because I needed another notebook, because I wanted one that had never been used to organize someone else's life. That evening, I sat on the balcony after Ethan had gone to bed. The new journal rested on my lap. I opened to the first page. For several minutes, I wrote nothing. Then, slowly, I began. Not about Ethan, not about lies, not about disappointment. Instead, I answered one simple question: what do I want? At first, the answers felt strangely difficult. A kitchen that feels peaceful, more time with Claire, a home filled with books, to travel to Scotland, to learn watercolor painting, to wake up without anxiety, to laugh more, to stop apologizing for needing love. By the time I reached the bottom of the page, tears blurred the ink. Not because I was sad, because I couldn't remember the last time I'd asked myself what I wanted before asking what someone else needed. Monday arrived carrying unexpected news. Rebecca appeared in my doorway before lunch. I just came from HR. I looked up. And? She grinned. They've narrowed the candidates. My heartbeat quickened. You made the final 3. For a moment, the room disappeared. Not because I'd won, because someone had seen me, not as someone's partner, not as someone's support system, as me. Rebecca hugged me before leaving. When the door closed, I allowed myself exactly 60 seconds to celebrate. Then I went back to work. Some victories don't need applause. They need consistency. That evening, Ethan suggested they celebrate his upcoming presentation at an exclusive rooftop restaurant downtown. As the waiter poured sparkling water, Ethan leaned back in his chair. I've been thinking. I looked up. About what? The future. For years, those words would have filled me with hope. This time, I simply waited. I think we should hold off on making any major changes for a while. What kind of changes? You know, he smiled casually. Career moves. I tilted my head. Why? Things are finally lining up for me. He reached across the table. I just need everything to stay stable until after the partnership decision. Everything. Not us. Not our dreams. Everything. Meaning, me. The apartment. The routines. The certainty that I would always be there. I stirred my water slowly. What if something important came along for me? He laughed softly. It'll still be there. Maybe. Maybe not. Opportunity has never been particularly patient. Neither, I realized, was I anymore. 2 mornings later, my phone rang just after 8. Margaret. Good morning, Olivia. Good morning. I hope you have a few minutes. I do. She paused. The executive committee has reached a decision. I stood beside my office window, looking out at the courtyard where patients were already beginning their morning walks. My pulse echoed in my ears. We'd like to offer you the position. Everything became very quiet. Congratulations. The word floated toward me from somewhere far away. My hands trembled ever so slightly. Thank you. We're thrilled. There is one condition. My heart skipped. The position requires relocating to our regional headquarters. I swallowed. Where? Margaret smiled. Chicago. Chicago. 800 miles away. A city I'd never imagined living in. A chance to rebuild every part of my life. A chance that had arrived at precisely the moment I'd begun remembering who I was. Margaret gave me 2 weeks to decide. When the call ended, I remained standing at the window. 800 miles. One decision, one future. I had spent 6 years waiting for someone else to choose me. Now life was asking a different question. Would I finally choose myself? People imagine that life-changing decisions arrive with certainty. They don't. They arrive wrapped in ordinary mornings. Coffee that grows cold while you stare at an email. A calendar that suddenly feels too small. A city you've never lived in, quietly asking whether you're brave enough to begin again. For 2 days, I told no one about Chicago. Not Claire, not Rebecca, certainly not Ethan. I carried the offer letter inside my leather notebook everywhere I went, reading it during lunch breaks, before meetings, and once while sitting alone in my car after work. Every time I finished reading it, one sentence lingered longer than the others. We believe your leadership can shape the future of this organization. It struck me that no one had spoken about my future with that kind of confidence in years. Friday evening, Ethan returned home carrying a bottle of wine. "I've got good news," he announced. I smiled. "Another client? Bigger." He loosened his tie and leaned against the kitchen counter. "My presentation next week is basically a formality now." Richard practically confirmed it. Richard, the managing partner, the man Ethan had spent years trying to impress. "I told you things were finally coming together." He poured 2 glasses before handing one to me. "To the future." I looked at the glass for a moment before raising it. "To the future." The words sounded different now. He heard one future, I heard another. The weekend passed quietly. Saturday morning, I visited my mother's grave for the first time in almost 6 months. Fresh flowers rested nearby from someone else who had visited earlier. I knelt beside the stone and brushed away a few fallen leaves. "I got an offer," I whispered. The breeze moved gently through the trees. "I wish I could ask you what to do." Of course there was no answer. But standing there, something unexpected settled inside me. For years, I had imagined my mother telling me to be patient, to work harder, to keep loving. Now I realized I had been remembering her wrong. My mother had never taught me to make myself smaller. She had taught me to stand tall with kindness. Somewhere along the way, I had confused kindness with surrender. They were never the same thing. Monday morning, Rebecca closed my office door behind her. "You've been avoiding me." "I've been thinking." "That's exactly what worries me." I laughed softly. "I have news." She folded her arms. "I knew it." "I was offered the position." Rebecca's face lit up instantly. "I knew they'd choose you." Then she noticed I wasn't celebrating. "You haven't accepted." "I haven't." "Why?" I looked down at the offer letter. "Chicago." She blinked. "That's incredible. It's also 800 miles away." She nodded slowly. "And Ethan." There it was, the name sitting between opportunity and fear. Rebecca sat across from me. "Can I ask you something?" "Always." If Ethan received the opportunity of a lifetime in another city, she let the question hang. "What do you think he'd do?" I didn't answer, because I already knew he would go. Not because he didn't love me, because he believed his dreams deserved room to grow. The painful part wasn't imagining Ethan choosing himself. It was realizing I had never believed I was allowed to do the same. That evening, I cooked dinner while Ethan worked on his presentation in the study. The apartment was unusually quiet. As I chopped vegetables, I looked around the kitchen. The blue bowls we'd picked together, the framed recipe from my grandmother, the coffee machine Ethan insisted on buying. Every object held a memory. But memories aren't foundations. They're photographs. Beautiful to revisit, impossible to live inside. Dinner ended with Ethan clearing his plate. "I'll be in the study." "Okay." He disappeared down the hallway. I remained at the table. The offer letter rested inside my notebook beside my chair. For nearly 20 minutes, I stared at the closed study door. Then I stood, walked slowly down the hallway, knocked once. "Come in." Ethan looked up from his laptop. "Everything okay?" I handed him the envelope. "What's this?" "A job offer." He smiled. "That's great." He opened it. Read silently. His smile faded. "Chicago?" "Yes." He looked up. "When were you going to tell me?" "I just did." He set the papers down carefully. "You're not seriously considering this." It wasn't a question. I pulled out the chair opposite him and sat. "I haven't made a decision." "You don't have to." His answer came too quickly. "Our lives are here." I studied his face. "Our lives?" "Of course." "What does that include?" He frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean," I spoke calmly, "if I say no to this opportunity, what exactly am I saying yes to?" Silence filled the room. Not uncomfortable. Revealing. Finally, Ethan leaned back. "We've talked about marriage. We've talked about it. We're getting there." "When?" Another pause. "I don't know." "What year?" He looked away. "I can't give you a timeline." 6 years, and still, no timeline, no plan, just another version of eventually. I nodded once. "I understand." He seemed relieved, as though the conversation had ended. It hadn't. Not for me. 3 days later, Ethan gave his presentation. I wished him luck before he left. I genuinely meant it. Whatever happened between us, I wanted him to succeed. Success wasn't the enemy. Fear was. That afternoon, While I was leading a leadership workshop, my phone buzzed twice. A message from Ethan. Presentation went great. 5 minutes later. Richard wants dinner tomorrow to discuss next steps. I smiled. Then I placed my phone face down and continued teaching. For the first time in years, his news no longer interrupted my life. It simply became part of it. And that subtle shift changed everything. Friday evening arrived with surprising speed. Ethan returned home later than expected. He looked exhausted. Long dinner? He loosened his tie slowly. Long conversation. Good or bad? He hesitated. They're delaying the partnership decision. I'm sorry. They want another quarter. He laughed bitterly. Apparently they need more time. More time. The very phrase he'd given me for years. Now it had found its way back to him. Life has an odd way of holding mirrors in front of us. He sat heavily on the couch. I'm tired of waiting. The words escaped before he realized what he'd said. I looked at him quietly. So was I. I simply hadn't been waiting for the same thing anymore. That night, long after Ethan had fallen asleep, I stood alone in the living room with the Chicago offer letter in my hands. The acceptance deadline was now 6 days away. Outside, rain tapped gently against the windows. Inside, the apartment felt smaller than it ever had before. Not because the walls had moved, because my future no longer fit inside them. For the first time in 6 years, I understood something with complete clarity. The hardest part of leaving isn't packing your belongings. It's admitting that you've already outgrown the life you're trying so hard to protect. And somewhere deep inside me, a decision had already begun. I just hadn't spoken it aloud yet. People think courage arrives all at once. It doesn't. Most of the time, courage begins as a quiet refusal. A refusal to keep shrinking. A refusal to keep explaining away disappointment. 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 Who would I become if I turned it down? The answer frightened me more than moving 800 miles away. I would become the woman who abandoned herself one more time. I had already met her. I wasn't willing to become her again. Tuesday morning, I woke before sunrise. The apartment was silent. I walked into the kitchen, made coffee exactly the way I liked it, and sat by the window watching the first light spread across the rooftops. For years, every important decision in my life had begun with Ethan. What would he think? Would this inconvenience him? Would he understand? That morning, his opinion never entered my mind. Not because I no longer cared, because I had finally remembered that my life belonged to me first. It was an unfamiliar feeling, but it was also strangely peaceful. At work, Margaret stopped by my office. "No pressure," she said with a warm smile. "I just wanted to check in. We know this is a significant decision. I appreciate that." She paused before leaving. For what it's worth, I looked up. Great opportunities don't always come at convenient times. After she left, I stared out my office window. Maybe there was no such thing as perfect timing. Maybe life simply rewarded the people willing to move before certainty arrived. That evening, Claire came over carrying takeout from my favorite Thai restaurant. She looked around the apartment and smiled. "It still smells like Ethan's coffee." I laughed. "It probably always will." We ate at the kitchen island. Halfway through dinner, she put down her chopsticks. "Can I ask you something?" "You always do. If Ethan said yes tomorrow, yes to what?" "Marriage." The question settled between us. I looked at the steam rising from my tea. "I don't know." Claire tilted her head. "You used to know." I did. "What changed?" I smiled sadly. I realized I wasn't waiting for a proposal anymore. "What were you waiting for?" "I was waiting to feel chosen." The words surprised even me. Because they were true. Not chosen for convenience. Not chosen because I made life easier. Chosen because someone couldn't imagine building a future without me. Claire reached across the counter and squeezed my hand. "You deserve that." For years, I had hoped someone else would convince me of that. Hearing my sister say it reminded me that perhaps I'd been looking in the wrong direction all along. The next afternoon, my phone buzzed during lunch. It was Ethan. "Can we have dinner tonight?" "Just us," I replied. "Of course." He chose the small neighborhood restaurant where we'd had our third date. Back then, neither of us had much money. We had shared one dessert because we couldn't afford two. We laughed all evening. We talked about books, travel, dreams, who we wanted to become. I remembered thinking how easy everything felt. Sitting there 6 years later, I realized the restaurant hadn't changed. We had. Ethan seemed unusually nervous. After the waiter left, he folded his hands together. "I've been doing a lot of thinking." "So have I. I know I've been distracted." I waited. "I've let work become too important." I still waited. "I don't want to lose what we have." For the first time in years, he wasn't talking about a project, or a client, or a promotion. He was talking about us. A younger version of me would have taken that as enough. The woman sitting there now needed something different. "What does that mean?" I asked gently. "It means—" He hesitated. "I want us to move forward." "How?" "We'll figure it out." I smiled sadly. "Ethan," he looked at me. "We've been figuring it out for 6 years." Silence. Not hostile, just honest. He rubbed the back of his neck. "I know. No." I shook my head softly. "I don't think you do." I reached into my handbag and removed the Chicago offer letter. I placed it between us. He looked down at it, then back at me. "I've decided." His expression tightened. "You're turning it down." It wasn't a question. I looked at him with more compassion than anger. "No." The word hung quietly in the air. "I'm accepting it." For several seconds, he didn't speak. Finally, he asked, "When?" "I'll be relocating in 7 weeks." He leaned back in his chair. "So?" His voice cracked slightly. "That's it?" I thought carefully before answering. "No." I met his eyes. "This isn't the end of us because of Chicago." I paused. "It's the end because somewhere along the way, I stopped believing I had to earn a place in someone's life." He looked away. "I never asked you to earn it." No." I smiled gently. "You just stopped making room for it." Neither of us raised our voices. Neither of us cried. Sometimes relationships don't end with explosions. Sometimes they end because two people finally tell the truth. When the check arrived, Ethan reached for it automatically. I placed my hand over his. "Let me." He looked confused. "I invited you." "I know." I smiled. "But this one is mine." He slowly withdrew his hand. It was a small gesture, yet somehow, it felt like reclaiming something much larger. That night, we walked back to the apartment together in silence. The city lights reflected on the wet pavement after an evening rain. At the front door, Ethan stopped. "I never wanted to hurt you." I believed him. That was the heartbreaking part. Pain isn't always caused by cruelty. Sometimes it's caused by neglect, by assumptions, by believing someone strong will keep carrying the weight forever. "I know," I said quietly, "but not intending to hurt someone isn't the same as protecting their heart." He nodded. Neither of us had anything left to add. Over the next week, we began dividing a life we'd built together. Books, furniture, kitchen dishes, photographs. There were no arguments, only decisions. Some were easy, some took longer. One evening, I found the ceramic bowl from the pottery class I'd abandoned 4 years earlier. Still unfinished, still wrapped in newspaper. I held it for a long moment. Then I smiled. "I'm taking this one." Ethan looked over. "I forgot you made that." I almost did too. As I packed it carefully into a box, I realized it wasn't the bowl I was saving. It was the woman who had once believed she could create something with her own hands. She deserved another chance. And this time, I intended to give it to her. 3 days before my departure, Margaret called. "The board would like to announce your appointment next Monday." I smiled. "I'll be there." After the call ended, I stood alone in the apartment. Half the boxes were already stacked by the front door. The walls looked strangely empty. So did the future. But for the first time in years, empty didn't feel frightening. It felt full of possibility. The hardest chapter of my life was ending. Not because someone finally chose me, but because I finally had. People talk about fresh starts as though they're exciting. Sometimes they are. Most of the time, they're terrifying. The morning I left Virginia, the sky was the pale gray of early autumn. The moving truck had already pulled away. My car was packed with the things I couldn't trust anyone else to carry. A cardboard box filled with family photographs, my mother's pearl earrings, the unfinished ceramic bowl from that pottery class, the leather journal I'd bought at the farmer's market, and a framed picture of Claire and me when we were children, standing on a beach neither of us could remember but both of us somehow missed. Claire hugged me outside my apartment building. She held on longer than usual. "I'm proud of you," she whispered. I smiled. "I don't feel brave." "You don't have to." She stepped back and looked at me. "You just have to keep driving. Sometimes the people who love us don't remove our fear. They simply remind us that fear doesn't get the final vote." The drive to Chicago took 2 days. I could have flown. Instead, I wanted the miles. I wanted to feel the distance growing between the woman I had been and the woman I was becoming. Somewhere in Ohio, I stopped at a small roadside diner. Nothing special. Just hot coffee, scrambled eggs, and a waitress who called everyone honey. As I stirred cream into my coffee, I realized no one in that room knew anything about me. They didn't know I'd left a 6-year relationship. They didn't know how many nights I'd cried quietly in a bathroom so Ethan wouldn't hear me. They didn't know how close I'd come to saying no to the biggest opportunity of my career. To them, I was simply another woman eating breakfast before continuing her journey. For reasons I couldn't explain, that felt incredibly freeing. Sometimes healing begins the moment your past stops introducing you before you can introduce yourself. Chicago greeted me with cool air and the sound of trains echoing between tall buildings. My apartment wasn't large. 1 bedroom, hardwood floors, big windows overlooking a tree-lined street. It wasn't luxurious. It was mine. That single word carried more peace than I expected. Mine. My lease. My mailbox. My keys. My decisions. That first evening, I ordered takeout, sat on the floor because my furniture hadn't arrived yet, and watched the sunset paint the skyline in shades of gold and deep orange. There was no television, no background noise, only silence. 6 months earlier, silence would have frightened me. Now it felt like a conversation with myself I'd been postponing for years. Work began the following Monday. The headquarters bustled with energy. New faces, new systems, new expectations. Margaret introduced me to department heads from across the organization. By lunchtime, my notebook already held 3 pages of ideas. Not because anything was broken, because I could finally imagine improving something without asking permission first. Late that afternoon, one of the senior directors stopped by my office. "I'm David Morgan." He extended his hand. "I've heard good things about you." David was in his early 50s, thoughtful, soft-spoken, the kind of person who listened without rushing to fill quiet moments. Over the next few weeks, our conversations stayed entirely professional. Leadership, budgets, community partnerships, nothing more. It was refreshing. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't wondering whether someone approved of me. I was simply doing the work I loved. Back in Virginia, Ethan and I spoke only when necessary, mostly about forwarding mail or final paperwork. The conversations were brief, respectful. One afternoon, he called unexpectedly. "I just wanted to make sure you got the last insurance documents." "I did." A pause. "How's Chicago?" I looked out my office window. "It's beginning to feel like home." "I'm glad." Another pause. "I've been thinking a lot." I smiled gently, even though he couldn't see me. "I hope that's been good for you." "It has." His voice was quieter than I remembered. I wish I'd understood sooner. There it was. The sentence I'd spent years hoping to hear. And yet, it didn't change anything, because apologies cannot restore years that were lived waiting. "I appreciate you saying that," I replied. "I really do." We wished each other well. The call ended. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I simply placed my phone back on my desk and continued reviewing the budget proposal in front of me. Healing isn't the absence of emotion. It's the absence of needing a different ending. Winter arrived early. Snow dusted the sidewalks outside my apartment. One Saturday morning, I unpacked the final moving box. At the very bottom sat the unfinished ceramic bowl. I ran my fingers gently along its rough edges. Then I searched online for pottery studios near me. The first class met the following Thursday. As I walked into the studio carrying an apron still folded in its packaging, the instructor welcomed everyone warmly. Around me sat retirees, college students, a young couple celebrating an anniversary. No one asked why I was there. No one knew I was picking up something I'd abandoned years earlier. Halfway through class, I centered a lump of clay on the wheel. The instructor smiled. "Don't fight it." I laughed. "I'm trying not to. Clay has a funny way of teaching people about control." I looked down at my hands. Maybe life did too. Some things can't be forced. They can only be shaped with patience. That evening, I opened my leather journal for the first time in weeks. On a fresh page, I wrote one sentence. The moment I stopped begging to be chosen wasn't the day I left Ethan. I paused. Then I continued. It was the day I realized I had been worthy all along. I closed the journal and looked around my apartment. The walls were slowly filling with photographs I had chosen. Books lined the shelves. Music drifted softly from the kitchen. There was still loneliness sometimes. Healing isn't a straight road. But loneliness no longer felt like failure. It felt like space. Space for friendships, for purpose, for possibilities I hadn't yet imagined. Outside my window, snow continued falling quietly over the city. Inside, something even quieter settled in my heart. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for my life to begin. I was already living it, and although I couldn't see it yet, one final chapter was waiting just around the corner, one that would show me that choosing yourself doesn't end your story. Sometimes, it's where the best part finally begins. People often ask what happened after I left, as though healing begins the moment you pack the last box. It doesn't. Healing is quieter than that. It happens in ordinary moments that don't seem important until you look back and realize they changed you. It happens the first time you buy groceries without wondering whether someone else likes the brand you picked. It happens the first Sunday morning you wake up naturally instead of because someone else's alarm clock goes off. It happens when you laugh out loud alone in your kitchen and suddenly realize there isn't anyone there to tell you you're being too loud. Freedom rarely announces itself. It simply arrives. Spring came slowly to Chicago. The trees outside my apartment began replacing gray branches with small green leaves. The neighborhood cafe on the corner learned my order. Strong coffee, one splash of oat milk, no sweetener. The barista smiled every morning. The usual? The usual. There was comfort in becoming familiar somewhere new, not because I needed people to know my name, because I was finally building a life that belonged entirely to me. Work became both challenging and deeply rewarding. The initiatives I had proposed during my first month began moving forward. A mobile health program reached neighborhoods that had never received regular preventive care. A mentorship program paired young administrators with experienced leaders. For the first time in my career, I wasn't simply managing problems, I was helping shape solutions. One Friday afternoon, Margaret stopped by my office carrying a folder. "You've had quite a year," I smiled. "It feels longer," she laughed. "The board noticed your work." She handed me the folder. Inside was a letter confirming that our department had received additional funding because of the programs we'd launched. "Congratulations." I looked down at the numbers. It wasn't the money that moved me. It was what the letter represented. Someone believed in my ideas enough to invest in them. For years, I had invested my energy into convincing one person to see my worth. Now entire teams were building something, because they already did. That weekend, Claire came to visit. She walked into my apartment, carrying a bouquet of sunflowers. "You've changed the place again." I finally hung the artwork. She walked slowly through the living room. Every photograph on the wall had been taken after I moved to Chicago. Weekend markets, snow-covered streets, the pottery studio, a sunset over the lake. There wasn't a single picture connected to my old life. Claire noticed. "You packed away the past." I stopped decorating with memories that hurt. She looked at me for a long moment. "You seem lighter." I laughed softly. I think I finally stopped carrying someone else's expectations. On Sunday morning, we rented bicycles and rode along the lakefront. Families filled the parks. Children flew kites in the spring wind. Somewhere near Navy Pier, Claire slowed beside me. "Can I ask something? When have you ever needed permission?" She smiled. Do you miss him? The question deserved an honest answer. I miss parts of my old life. The routines, the familiarity, the version of me that believed everything would eventually work out. She nodded. But I don't miss waiting. The wind carried our silence for several moments. Then Claire smiled. I was hoping you'd say that. A few weeks later, I received an invitation to speak at a national leadership conference. The audience would include executives from nonprofit organizations across the country. 5 years earlier, I would have declined. I would have worried about travel, scheduling, whether Ethan needed me home. This time, I accepted before doubt had a chance to interrupt. The conference took place in Denver. Standing backstage before my presentation, I looked at the audience gathering beyond the curtains. Hundreds of people. Somewhere among them were women and men, quietly wondering whether they belonged in the rooms they'd worked so hard to enter. I understood that feeling. When my name was announced, I walked onto the stage. Not because I wasn't nervous, because courage had become something I practiced, instead of something I waited to feel. Near the end of my presentation, I said something that surprised even me. Leadership isn't only about guiding other people. The room became very still. Sometimes leadership begins the day you stop abandoning yourself. I didn't realize how deeply I believed those words until I heard myself say them aloud. The applause that followed wasn't the loudest I'd ever heard, but it felt like the most meaningful, because for the first time, I wasn't being recognized for how well I'd supported someone else's success. I was standing in the light of my own. Months passed. The seasons changed again. One Saturday afternoon, while cleaning a kitchen drawer, I found the leather journal I'd bought at the farmer's market the year before. I smiled and sat by the window. The first page still held the list I had written on my balcony in Virginia. A peaceful kitchen, travel, painting, laugh more, stop apologizing for needing love. I read each line slowly. Some had already come true. Others were still becoming. Then I turned to the final blank page. For a long time, I simply looked at it. Finally, I wrote, "The greatest mistake I ever made wasn't loving someone who couldn't love me the way I needed." I paused, then continued. It was believing I had to become less of myself to deserve being loved at all. I closed the journal gently. Outside, evening sunlight filled the apartment. My apartment. The words still made me smile. A few days later, I received an unexpected envelope in the mail. The return address was familiar, Virginia. Inside was a handwritten note from Ethan. No dramatic declarations, no requests to start over, just a single page. He wrote that he had begun seeing a counselor, that he had spent months examining the ways ambition had become more important than presence. He apologized without asking for forgiveness. He thanked me for showing him a truth he hadn't wanted to face. At the bottom of the page, he wrote one final sentence. "I hope you've built the life you always deserved." I folded the letter carefully, placed it back in the envelope, and tucked it inside a keepsake box, not because I intended to read it again, but because it belonged to a chapter that had finally ended. Forgiveness, I realized, isn't reopening a closed door. Sometimes it's simply deciding you no longer need to stand outside it. That evening, I stood on my apartment balcony, watching the city lights flicker to life. A gentle breeze carried the sounds of distant traffic and laughter from the street below. I thought about the woman who had once measured her worth by whether someone else chose her. I barely recognized her anymore. Not because she had been weak, because she had finally learned that strength and self-respect can grow from the same broken place. The woman I had become wasn't fearless. She still wondered. She still hoped. She still carried scars. But those scars no longer told her where she couldn't go. They reminded her how far she had already come. And as I looked out across the city, I realized something that would have been impossible for me to believe a year earlier. My happiest chapter had never been waiting for another person. It had been waiting for me. If you've ever watched the sun rise over a city before most people are awake, you know something about second chances. They don't arrive with applause. They don't ask whether you're ready. They simply appear, quietly, asking only one question. What will you do with today? A year after I moved to Chicago, my life no longer felt like something I was repairing. It felt like something I was building. There is a difference. Repairing is about returning to what was. Building is about creating something that has never existed before. For so long, I thought happiness meant getting back to the woman I had been before Ethan. I was wrong. She had been kind, hopeful, hardworking, but she was also afraid. Afraid of being alone, afraid of starting over, afraid that loving herself first somehow meant she loved other people less. The woman I had become still carried compassion. She still believed in commitment. She still believed love mattered, but she no longer believed love required disappearing. One crisp October morning, I unlocked the doors to a new community health center our organization had spent 18 months building. Children laughed in the waiting room, while volunteers arranged books in a reading corner. Nurses greeted elderly patients by name. Families who had once traveled hours for basic care now had help within walking distance. As I stood quietly near the entrance, Margaret joined me. "You should be proud." I smiled. This wasn't just me. "No," she nodded. "But leadership rarely is." She looked around the building. "You gave people permission to believe this was possible." I thought about those words long after she walked away. Maybe that's what the best leaders actually do. They remind people that hope can become a plan. Later that afternoon, I received an email from the pottery studio. The instructor had selected several student pieces for a neighborhood art exhibition. My name was on the list. I laughed out loud, not because I suddenly believed I was an artist, because the unfinished bowl I'd nearly forgotten years ago had become a set of handmade serving dishes I now used every Sunday. Life has an interesting sense of humor. Sometimes the things we abandon are simply waiting until we're ready to return to them. That weekend, Claire came to visit again. We wandered through a street festival lined with local artists, musicians, and food trucks. As we sat on a park bench eating caramel apples, she looked at me and smiled. "You know something?" "What?" "This is the first time I've seen you where you're not waiting." I looked around. Families, friends, children chasing bubbles through the autumn air. I hadn't realized. "You used to spend every conversation talking about what might happen." She nudged my shoulder. "Now you talk about what is happening." I thought about that for a moment. She was right. Hope had stopped living somewhere in the future. It had quietly moved into the present. Several months later, our organization hosted a leadership retreat in Colorado. During one of the workshops, participants were paired for a problem-solving exercise. My partner introduced himself with an easy smile. "My name's Michael." He worked for another nonprofit healthcare system. Our conversation lasted less than 45 minutes. We spoke about leadership, community outreach, books, travel, nothing extraordinary. When the session ended, he smiled. "I enjoyed talking with you." "I enjoyed talking with you too." He handed me his business card. "If you're ever back in Denver, coffee's on me." That was all. No promises, no dramatic music, no instant certainty, just a pleasant conversation between two adults who respected each other. Months earlier, I would have spent days wondering what it meant. Instead, I slipped the card into my notebook and went back to the next session. Some connections don't need to be rushed. The healthiest ones rarely are. On a quiet Sunday morning, nearly 2 years after I left Virginia, I opened the kitchen drawer looking for a measuring spoon. Instead, my hand found the old leather journal. I sat by the window with a fresh cup of coffee and slowly turned the pages. There was the list I'd written the night I first asked myself what I wanted. A peaceful home, more laughter, travel, painting, to stop apologizing for needing love. Then there were pages filled with fear, pages filled with hope, pages filled with discoveries I had almost forgotten making. Near the end of the journal, I found a blank page. Only one remained. I uncapped my pen. For several minutes, I simply watched the morning light move across the paper. Finally, I wrote, "I spent years believing I was asking someone else to choose me." I paused, then continued. "The truth is, every day I stayed silent, I was the one choosing less for myself." My eyes filled with tears. Not because I regretted those years. Regret is a heavy thing to carry forever. Instead, I felt grateful. Grateful that I had lived long enough to recognize the lesson before it was too late. Grateful that life had been patient enough to give me another chance. Grateful that somewhere inside the frightened woman I used to be, there had always been someone brave enough to leave. She had simply needed time to find her voice. That afternoon, I opened every window in my apartment. A cool breeze drifted through the rooms. Music played softly from the kitchen. I cooked using the handmade dishes from my pottery class. I set the table for one. Years ago, that would have made me feel lonely. Now it felt like peace. Not because I believed I would always be alone, but because I had learned something far more important. Your ability to enjoy your own company is not the end of love. It is the beginning of every healthy version of it. Sometimes people ask me whether I ever loved Ethan. The answer is yes. Completely. Honestly. With every part of the woman I was then. And if you asked whether I would erase those 6 years if I could, the answer might surprise you. No. Because those years taught me the difference between being needed and being valued, between waiting and living, between hoping someone would choose you and finally choosing yourself. Those lessons were expensive, but they gave me back a life that belonged to me. So if you're listening to this today, while sitting in a parking lot after work, or lying awake beside someone who makes you question your worth, or wondering whether it's too late to begin again, I hope you remember this. You do not have to become smaller to keep someone comfortable. You do not have to postpone your dreams until someone else feels ready. And you do not have to beg for a place in a life where your presence should already be cherished. The moment I stopped begging to be chosen, I discovered something I wish I had known years earlier. I was never waiting for him. I was waiting for myself. And the woman I found on the other side of that decision was worth every difficult mile it took to meet her. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this story. If Olivia's journey resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share in the comments the moment you chose yourself, or the lesson that stayed with you the most. Stories like these remind us that we're often stronger than we realize. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another journey of healing, resilience, and hope. And before you go, 2 more stories are waiting on your screen. If this one touched your heart, I think they'll stay with you too. Until next time, take care of yourself, and remember, sometimes the most important person who can choose you is you.